They called me the ugliest woman in London, and for 7 years I let them believe it was true. What none of them knew, what I guarded like a wound that never quite healed, was that I had chosen my own invisibility the moment I understood that pity was far worse than scorn. I remember the morning everything changed with a clarity that still cuts through me. I was 15. Dressed in pale blue muslin, my hair pinned with the pearl clips my mother had worn on her wedding day. The season had just begun, and my father, the Earl of Ashford, had promised me that this year the ballrooms of London would finally learn my name. I had practiced my curtsy until my knees ached. I had memorized the steps of every dance. I had dreamed, as all girls dream, of a gentleman whose eyes would find mine across a crowded room and see something worth keeping. The carriage accident happened 3 days before my debut. I do not remember the sound of the horses screaming, though my father told me later that it was the most terrible thing he had ever heard. I do not remember the way the world tilted, the splintering of wood, the shattering of glass. What I remember is waking in my bedroom with my face wrapped in bandages and my mother weeping at my bedside, her hand clutching mine so tightly I thought my fingers might break. The surgeon had done what he could. He was a kind man, I think, though I cannot recall his face. He told my father that I was fortunate to be alive, that the glass had missed my eye by less than an inch, that the wound would heal in time. What he did not say, what no one needed to say, was that the scar would remain forever. It ran from the corner of my left eye to the edge of my jaw, a pale river carved into my skin. In those first weeks, I could not bear to look at my own reflection. My mother covered every mirror in my chambers with black cloth, as though someone had died. Perhaps someone had. The girl I had been, the girl who dreamed of ballrooms and gentlemen and pearl-pinned hair, she did not survive that carriage ride. What emerged from the wreckage was someone else entirely. Society, as it always does, rendered its judgment swiftly. The whispers began before I had even left my bed. The Ashford girl, they said. Such a tragedy. She was to be quite pretty, you know. Now she will never marry. Her father will have to settle for a country vicar, perhaps, or a widower desperate enough to overlook her face. Poor thing. Poor, poor thing. I heard these words from my maid, who heard them from the kitchen staff, who heard them from the servants of other great houses. News travels quickly among those who are paid to be invisible. Within a fortnight, all of London knew that the Earl of Ashford's only daughter had been transformed from a promising debutante into an object of pity. But pity was not the worst of it. The worst came later, when I was 18 and my father insisted I attend Lady Pemberton's annual ball. He meant well, my father. He always meant well. He believed that if society could see me, could know me, they would understand that a scar did not diminish my worth. He did not understand that society had already decided my worth, and it was measured in the flawless porcelain of a woman's skin. I wore a gown of deep green silk that night, and my maid had arranged my hair to fall in soft waves over the left side of my face. It was not enough. It was never enough. I felt the stares like needles, heard the whispers like wasps buzzing at the edges of my awareness. And then, just before midnight, I heard a young lord say the words that would follow me for the rest of my life. London's ugliest, he called me. He was drunk, I think, and surrounded by friends who laughed at his wit. London's ugliest heiress. What a waste of a fortune. I did not cry. I had learned, by then, that tears were a luxury I could not afford. Instead, I lifted my chin, finished my glass of champagne, and asked my father to take me home. The next morning, I informed him that I would not be attending any more balls. I would not be paraded before society like a mare with a broken leg, waiting for someone kind enough to put me out of my misery. If I was to be London's ugliest, then I would be London's most invisible as well. My father did not argue. I think in his heart he was relieved. And so I retreated to Ashford Park, to the rolling green hills and the stables that had been my sanctuary since childhood. My father's horses became my world. I learned their names, their temperaments, their bloodlines. I watched foals take their first trembling steps and grew to understand the particular magic that transformed a promising yearling into a champion. The horses did not care about my scar. To them, I was simply the woman who brought apples and spoke softly and never raised a hand in anger. It was there, in the shadow of the stables, that I first saw Midnight Storm. He was born on a night of terrible weather, thunder shaking the walls and rain lashing the windows, and my father said it was a sign. "This one will be special," he told me, cradling the trembling black foal in his arms. "This one will change everything." I did not believe him then. I had stopped believing in signs and portents and the promise of better things to come. But I loved the foal anyway, loved his dark eyes and his velvet nose, and the way he nickered when he heard my footsteps approaching. By the time he was 3 years old, Midnight Storm was the fastest horse in England. My father's reputation, already considerable, soared to new heights. Offers poured in from every corner of the aristocracy, men willing to pay fortunes for the privilege of racing him, breeding him, owning even a piece of his legacy. My father refused them all. Midnight Storm was not for sale. He was family. And then the Duke of Ravensmore came calling. I knew of him, of course. All of London knew of Alexander Blackwood. He was the sort of man that women whispered about behind their fans, the sort of man whose entrance into a ballroom caused hearts to flutter and conversations to cease. Tall, dark-haired, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a jaw that seemed carved from marble. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, a storm on the horizon, a cliff's edge in moonlight. He was also, by all accounts, a reckless gambler whose fortune was bleeding away at the horse tracks. My father received him in the study on a gray afternoon in October. I was not present for that first meeting, but I heard about it later from the servants. The Duke had been charming, they said, persuasive. He had spoken of Midnight Storm with a passion that bordered on obsession, had offered sums of money that made even my father's eyes widen, but my father, stubborn as always, had refused. The Duke returned the following week, and the week after that. Each time, his offers grew more extravagant. Each time, my father shook his head. It was not until the fourth visit that everything changed. I do not know what possessed my father to make such an offer. Perhaps he was tired of watching me wither in the countryside, tired of knowing that his only child would die alone and unloved. Perhaps he saw something in the Duke's desperation that reminded him of his own, years ago, when he had gambled everything on a horse and won. Or perhaps he simply believed in his foolish, hopeful heart that any husband was better than no husband at all. The terms were simple. The Duke could have Midnight Storm, could have the horse that would save his fortune and restore his reputation, but only as a dowry, only if he agreed to marry me. I learned of this arrangement not from my father, but from a letter that arrived 3 days later. It was written in the Duke's own hand, formal and precise, informing me that our wedding would take place in 6 weeks' time. There was no proposal, no courtship, no pretense of affection. He had agreed to the bargain, and I was part of the price. I should have been furious. I should have stormed into my father's study and demanded he release me from this humiliation. But when I tried to summon my anger, I found only a hollow ache where my pride used to be. What did it matter after all? I was 22 years old, long past the age when respectable women married. I had no prospects, no hopes, no future beyond the quiet solitude of Ashford Park. At least as a duchess, I would have a purpose. At least I would be more than London's ugliest heiress, gathering dust in the countryside like a forgotten piece of furniture. And so I said yes. The wedding took place on a cold morning in December in the small chapel at Ashford Park. I wore my mother's dress, altered to fit my frame, and a veil so heavy and thick that I could barely see through it. My father had insisted on the veil. He said it was tradition, but I knew the truth. He was ashamed. He did not want the Duke to see my face until it was too late to change his mind. I walked down the aisle alone. My father waited at the altar, ready to give me away, but there was no one to escort me, no one to hold my trembling hand. The chapel was nearly empty, just a handful of servants and a priest who seemed eager to finish the ceremony and return to his warm rectory. The Duke stood at the front, his back to me, his shoulders rigid beneath his dark coat. He did not turn around until I reached his side. Even then, even knowing what he was, I felt my breath catch at the sight of him. He was more beautiful than the rumors had promised, all sharp angles and brooding intensity, like a hero from one of the novels I used to read before I learned that heroes did not exist. His eyes swept over me, taking in the heavy veil, the trembling hands, the modest dress that did nothing to flatter my figure. I saw no warmth in his gaze, no curiosity, only the cold calculation of a man assessing his purchase. The ceremony was brief. I spoke my vows in a voice that did not sound like my own, the words falling from my lips like stones dropped into deep water. To have and to hold, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. Each promise felt like a lie, a performance for an audience that did not care whether we meant any of it. He spoke his vows in a tone of barely concealed impatience, his eyes fixed somewhere above my head, as though he could not bear to look at the veiled creature he was binding himself to. When the priest pronounced us man and wife, the Duke did not kiss me. He simply offered his arm, led me down the aisle with the brisk efficiency of a man completing an unpleasant errand, and handed me into a waiting carriage. The leather seats were cold despite the fur blankets draped across them, and I shivered as the door closed behind me, sealing me into this new life I had not chosen. We did not speak during the journey to his estate. I sat across from him, my veil still in place, watching the countryside roll past the frosted window. He stared out the opposite side, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on his knee. I wondered if he was thinking of Midnight Storm, of the races he would win, the debts he would pay, the fortune he would rebuild. I wondered if he had thought of me at all. Ravensmoor Hall rose out of the winter mist like a spectre, all gray stone and towering spires and windows that glittered like cold eyes in the fading afternoon light. It was beautiful, I suppose, in the way that tombs are beautiful, grand and imposing and utterly lifeless. The gardens that flanked the long drive were dormant, their skeletal branches reaching toward a sky the color of old pewter. And I could not help but think that this place had been waiting for something, or someone, for a very long time. The servants lined up to greet us, 24 souls in crisp black and white, their faces carefully blank, and I felt their gazes slide over me like water over stone. They had heard the rumors, no doubt. They knew what their master had done, what he had accepted in exchange for a horse. I wondered how many of them pitied me. I wondered how many of them laughed behind closed doors. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Blackwood, who bore no relation to the Duke, showed me to my chambers. They were larger than my entire cottage at Ashford Park, decorated in shades of blue and silver, with a fireplace tall enough for me to stand in, and a bed so vast I could have lost myself in its depths. It was a room fit for a duchess. It felt like a prison. I sat before the mirror for a long time after she left, still wearing my veil, still wearing my mother's dress. The candles cast dancing shadows across the walls, and somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, its mournful toll echoing through empty corridors. I thought about the girl I had been at 15, the girl who dreamed of love and ballrooms and a gentleman's tender gaze. I thought about the woman I had become, scarred and bitter and so terribly alone. I thought about the man waiting somewhere in this cold, beautiful house, the man who had married me for a horse and would expect me to fulfill my duties as his wife. I wondered what he was doing at this very moment. Was he drinking brandy by a fire, congratulating himself on a successful acquisition? Was he already composing letters to his creditors, assuring them that midnight storm would win them all their fortunes back? Did he think of me at all? And then, slowly, I lifted the veil. The scar stared back at me, pale and permanent, a map of everything I had lost. But beneath it, I saw something else. I saw my mother's eyes, amber gold and fierce. I saw my father's stubborn jaw. I saw a woman who had survived a carriage accident, survived 7 years of whispers and scorn, survived being called the ugliest creature in London. I saw a woman who was still standing. I heard his footsteps in the corridor, measured and confident, and I knew he was coming. I knew what he expected to find behind my door. A grateful wife, perhaps. A meek and broken thing, so thankful for his condescension that she would submit to whatever he desired. He knocked once, twice. The sound was sharp against the heavy oak, demanding entry into a space that was supposed to be his by right. I did not answer. Instead, I rose from the mirror, crossed the room on trembling legs, and turned the key in the lock. The sound it made was small, almost insignificant, a soft click that seemed to echo in the vast silence of my chambers. But in that moment, it felt like a declaration of war. It felt like the first true choice I had made in 7 long years. His voice came through the door, low and surprised. "My lady, is something wrong?" I pressed my palm flat against the wood, feeling the vibration of his presence on the other side, feeling the weight of his confusion, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of something else, something that might have been curiosity. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe, and my palm was damp against the polished grain of the door. But when I spoke, my voice was steady. It was the voice of a woman who had finally remembered that she was more than her scar, more than her father's bargain, more than the cruelest nickname London had ever bestowed. "You married me for a horse, Your Grace. Very well. You shall have your precious stallion. But you will not have me. Not tonight. Not until you earn the right to stand in my presence as something more than a buyer collecting his purchase." Silence. A long, terrible silence that stretched between us like a chasm. And then, so quietly I almost missed it, I heard him laugh. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had just discovered that the game he thought he had won was only beginning. And in that moment, standing in my prison of blue and silver, I realized that I had done something very dangerous. I had made the Duke of Ravensmore curious. The days that followed my wedding night were a study in silence. I had expected fury. I had braced myself for cold retribution, for the Duke to assert his rights as my husband and demand entry into my chambers by force if necessary. The law, after all, was on his side. A wife belonged to her husband in every way that mattered, and a locked door was merely an obstacle, not a barrier. I had been foolish to think otherwise, foolish to believe that my small act of defiance would be tolerated by a man accustomed to getting everything he wanted. But Alexander Blackwood did not rage. He did not threaten. He did not even mention that first night, not in the days that followed. Not in the stilted conversations we shared over breakfast in the cavernous dining room where we sat at opposite ends of a table long enough to seat 30 guests. Instead, he watched me. I felt his gaze like a physical weight, following me through the corridors of Ravensmore Hall, lingering on my face when he thought I was not looking. It was not the gaze of a man who desired his wife. It was the gaze of a man trying to solve a puzzle, to understand how the meek, scarred creature he had purchased had transformed into something unexpected. I did not know whether to be flattered or afraid. The household, for its part, seemed unsure what to make of me. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, maintained her rigid formality, addressing me as Your Grace, with a precision that bordered on mockery. The maids whispered when they thought I could not hear, speculating about the state of my marriage, about the locked door that had become the worst-kept secret in the house. The footmen averted their eyes when I passed, as though my very presence was something shameful. Only one person in Ravensmore Hall treated me as though I belonged there, and she was a child of no more than 8 years old. Her name was Lily, and she was the daughter of one of the kitchen maids, a quiet woman named Sarah who had served the Blackwood family for over a decade. Lily had her mother's gentle eyes and a mop of unruly brown curls that refused to stay pinned beneath her cap. She was not supposed to be in the main house, not supposed to venture beyond the servants' quarters, but she had a way of appearing in the most unexpected places, her small face alight with curiosity. I found her in the library on my 3rd day at Ravensmoor Hall, curled up in a window seat with a book nearly as large as she was. She looked up when I entered, and I expected her to scramble away, to apologize for her intrusion and flee back to the kitchens where she belonged. Instead, she simply stared at me, her eyes wide and unafraid. "You are the new Duchess," she said. It was not a question. "I am," I replied, uncertain how to speak to this strange, fearless child. "And you are somewhere you should not be." She shrugged, a gesture so casual it made me want to laugh. "I like the books. Mama cannot read, so she does not know what I am missing. But I taught myself, from the signs in the village and the labels in the pantry. Now I come here when no one is looking. I should have scolded her. I should have sent her back to her mother with a warning to stay where she belonged. But something in her face, something in the defiant tilt of her chin, reminded me of myself at that age, before the accident, before the scar, before I learned that the world was not kind to girls who refused to know their place. "What are you reading?" I asked instead. She held up the book, and I saw that it was a volume of Greek myths, illustrated with engravings of gods and monsters and heroes whose names I had memorized as a child. She had it open to the story of Persephone, the goddess who was stolen by the king of the underworld and forced to live half her life in darkness. "I like this one," Lily said. "She is trapped, but she is also a queen. She has power, even in the place where she does not want to be." I sat down beside her, close enough to see the illustrations, but far enough to give her space. "And what do you think of that?" I asked. "Do you think power is enough, when you are trapped somewhere against your will?" She considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. "I think," she said slowly, "that power is better than nothing, and I think that even queens can find ways to escape if they are clever enough." I thought about those words for the rest of the day. I thought about them as I wandered the silent halls of Ravensmoor, as I took my meals in solitude, as I lay awake in my locked chamber listening to the wind howl against the windows. Power is better than nothing. Even queens can find ways to escape. But what if escape was not what I wanted? What if, despite everything, I wanted something far more dangerous? I wanted to be seen. On the 5th day of my marriage, I went to the stables. Midnight Storm had arrived the day after the wedding, transported from Ashford Park in a carriage specially designed for valuable horses. I had not been present for his arrival, but I had heard the commotion from my window, had watched the grooms leading him across the courtyard with the reverence usually reserved for royalty. He was even more magnificent than I remembered, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian, his muscles rippling beneath his skin as he tossed his proud head and surveyed his new domain. The Duke's stables were impressive, I had to admit. They were larger than my father's, built of honey-colored stone with high ceilings and wide stalls that allowed each horse room to move. The smell of hay and leather and warm animal filled my lungs as I stepped through the great doors, and for a moment, I was transported back to Ashford Park, to the only place I had ever felt truly at home. Midnight Storm recognized me immediately. He nickered as I approached his stall, pressing his velvet nose against the bars, and I felt tears prick at my eyes. I had not realized how much I missed him until this moment, had not understood how deeply the bond between us had grown over the years of his young life. "Hello, my darling," I whispered, stroking the white star on his forehead. "Have they been treating you well?" He snorted, as if to say that the accommodations were acceptable, but the company left much to be desired. I laughed, the first genuine laugh I had uttered since my arrival at Ravensmoor Hall, and pressed my forehead against his warm neck. That was how the Duke found me. I did not hear him approach. One moment I was alone with my horse, lost in the simple comfort of his presence, and the next I felt the air shift, felt the weight of another's gaze upon my back. I turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway of the stables with the afternoon light behind him, his face cast in shadow. "He comes to you," he said. His voice was low, thoughtful, stripped of the cold formality he usually employed. "I have been watching the grooms try to handle him for days. He will not let anyone near him. But he comes to you." I straightened, acutely aware of my disheveled appearance, of the hay clinging to my skirts and the loose strands of hair that had escaped my pins. "I raised him," I said simply. "From the night he was born. He knows my voice, my scent, my touch. To him I am safety." The Duke stepped closer, and I saw that his expression was different than I had ever seen it. There was no calculation in his eyes, no cold assessment. There was something that looked almost like wonder. "Show me," he said. I blinked. "I beg your pardon? Show me how you do it, how you make him trust you." His gaze flickered to Midnight Storm, who was watching him with the wary suspicion of a creature who had learned that humans were not to be trusted. "I have spent a fortune on trainers and handlers, but none of them can get close to him without risking their lives. Yet you walk in here, and he greets you like a long-lost friend." I hesitated. There was something vulnerable in his request, something that did not fit with the cold, calculating man who had married me for a horse. It would have been easy to refuse him, to use this small power as another weapon in our silent war. But I found that I did not want to refuse. I found that I wanted to show him. "Come here," I said quietly, "but move slowly, and do not look him in the eye." The Duke obeyed, approaching the stall with a caution I had not expected from a man so accustomed to command. Up close, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control he was exerting over every movement. He was afraid, I realized, not of the horse exactly, but of failing, of being found wanting in front of me. It was the first time I had seen him as anything other than a monster. "Give me your hand," I said. He extended his hand, and I took it before I could think better of it. His skin was warm against mine, his fingers long and elegant, the hands of an aristocrat who had never known a day of real labor. I guided his palm to Midnight Storm's neck, pressing it flat against the warm, smooth coat. "Feel his heartbeat," I murmured. "Let him feel yours. He needs to know that you are not a threat." We stood there in silence, the three of us, while the dust motes danced in the afternoon light and the world outside the stable doors faded to nothing. I watched the Duke's face as he felt the horse's pulse beneath his palm, watched the tension slowly drain from his shoulders, watched something crack open behind his eyes. "Why does he trust you?" he asked finally. His voice was barely above a whisper, as though he was afraid of breaking the spell. "What did you do to earn it?" "I did not do anything," I said. "I simply showed up. Every day, without fail, I came to him. I spoke to him. I listened to him. Trust is not something you can buy or demand or take by force. It must be given freely, and it can only be given to someone who has proven they are worthy of it." The Duke's eyes met mine, and I saw something flicker in their winter depths, something that looked almost like recognition. "Is that what you are waiting for?" he asked quietly. "For me to prove myself worthy?" I held his gaze, my heart pounding against my ribs. I did not know how to answer him. I did not know if I wanted to answer him at all, but the truth spilled from my lips before I could stop it. "I'm waiting for you to see me," I said. "Not my scar, not my father's fortune, not the ugly bride you acquired along with your prize stallion. Me, Eleanor, the woman who has spent 7 years being invisible because it was easier than being seen and found wanting." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. The Duke stared at me as though I had spoken in a language he did not understand, as though I had revealed some terrible secret that changed everything he thought he knew. And then, slowly, he lifted his free hand. I froze as his fingers approached my face, certain he meant to touch my scar, to trace the map of my disfigurement with the curiosity of a man examining a curiosity. But he did not touch the scar. Instead, his fingertips brushed the curve of my cheekbone, the unblemished skin on the right side of my face, as gentle as the wing of a moth. "I see you," he said. His voice was rough, almost broken. "I have seen you since the moment you lifted that veil. And what I see is not ugliness, Eleanor. What I see is fire." He dropped his hand and stepped back, as though the touch had burned him. Before I could speak, before I could even begin to process what had just happened, he turned and walked out of the stables, leaving me alone with Midnight Storm and the echo of words I had never expected to hear. That night, I did not lock my door. I sat in the chair beside the fireplace, wrapped in a shawl my mother had knitted before she died, and I waited. I did not know what I was waiting for. I did not know if he would come or what I would do if he did. I knew only that something had shifted between us, some invisible wall had cracked, and I was no longer certain which side of it I wanted to be on. The hours crawled past. The fire burned low. The candles guttered in their holders. And still I waited, my ears straining for the sound of footsteps in the corridor, my heart beating a rhythm that felt like hope and terror in equal measure. He did not come. I fell asleep in the chair sometime after midnight, and when I woke, the fire had gone cold, and pale winter light was filtering through the curtains. My back ached. My neck was stiff, and my heart felt heavier than it had the day before. I had offered him something, an opening, a chance to begin again, and he had not taken it. Perhaps I had been a fool to expect anything different. But when I rose to dress for breakfast, I found something that had not been there the night before. A single white rose placed on the table beside my door, its petals still fresh with morning dew. And beneath it, a note in the Duke's elegant hand. "I am not yet worthy, but I am trying." I pressed the rose to my heart and wept. In the days that followed, the household began to notice a change. The Duke no longer avoided me at meals. He sought me out in the library, in the gardens, in the stables where Midnight Storm was slowly learning to tolerate his presence. Our conversations were stilted at first, two strangers fumbling toward understanding, but gradually they grew easier. He told me about his childhood, about the father who had gambled away half the family fortune and the mother who had died of shame. I told him about my accident, about the girl I had been and the woman I had become. We did not touch. We did not speak of love or desire or the marriage bed that remained empty between us. But something was growing in the space we had carved out, something fragile and new, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through frozen ground. And then, 3 weeks after our wedding, a letter arrived that changed everything. It was addressed to me, not to my husband, and it bore the seal of my father's house. I opened it in the privacy of my chamber, my hands trembling with an anxiety I could not name, and read the words that would shatter the fragile peace I had begun to build. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "I write to you with news that I fear will cause you great distress. I have learned, through sources I cannot reveal, that your husband's interest in Midnight Storm was not merely financial. He made a wager, you see, before he ever came to Ashford Park. A wager with Lord Hartington, the man whose horse has dominated the racing circuit for the past 5 years. The terms were simple. Whoever wins the Epsom Derby this spring claims not only the purse, but the other's entire stable. Your husband bet everything on winning that race, Eleanor. Everything. And when he realized he could not win without Midnight Storm, he agreed to marry you. Not because your father demanded it, because losing you was a price he was willing to pay for a chance at victory. The letter continued, but I could not read any more. The words blurred before my eyes, swimming in a sea of tears I had sworn I would never shed again. He had not married me because my father forced his hand. He had married me because I was expendable, because a scarred, ugly bride was a small price to pay for a horse that could win him a fortune. I had been a fool to believe otherwise. I had been a fool to hope. And now I had to decide what to do with the shattered remains of my heart. I burned the letter. I watched the paper curl and blacken in the fireplace, watched my father's words dissolve into ash and smoke, and I told myself that I was burning away the foolish hope that had taken root in my heart. I had known from the beginning what this marriage was. I had known that Alexander Blackwood did not want me, had never wanted me, would never want me. And yet I had allowed myself to be seduced by a white rose and a handful of pretty words. "I see you," he had said. "What I see is fire, lies, all of it, lies." He had seen only what he needed to see, had said only what he needed to say, to keep me docile and compliant while he prepared for his precious race. I was nothing to him but a means to an end, a necessary inconvenience, a scarred face attached to a valuable horse. I dressed for dinner that evening with a calm I did not feel. I chose my finest gown, a deep crimson silk that my mother had commissioned for me before her death, and I pinned my hair in an elaborate style that left my scar fully visible. If I was to be London's ugliest, then I would wear my ugliness like armor. I would not hide. I would not cower. I would walk into that dining room and look my husband in the eye, and I would show him that his cruelty had not broken me. He was already seated when I arrived, a glass of wine in his hand, and a newspaper spread before him on the table. He looked up as I entered, and I saw his eyes widen slightly at my appearance. The crimson gown was more daring than anything I had worn since arriving at Ravensmoor Hall, cut lower at the bodice, fitted more closely to my figure. I had dressed to be seen, and I was gratified to note that he was seeing me now. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. The words were a blade between my ribs. Beautiful. He dared to call me beautiful when I knew the truth of what he thought of me, when I knew that he had wagered away his future on a horse and accepted me as the price of admission. I sat down at my usual place, at the far end of the table, and unfolded my napkin with deliberate precision. I did not thank him for the compliment. I did not acknowledge it at all. "I received a letter today," I said instead, "from my father." Something flickered across his face, too quick for me to identify. "Oh? And how is the Earl?" "He is well." I lifted my wine glass, watching the candlelight play through the deep red liquid. "He sends his regards. And he sends some rather interesting information about a wager you made before our marriage." The silence that fell between us was absolute. I watched Alexander's face, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his fingers tighten around the stem of his glass. He knew exactly what I was talking about, and he knew that his careful deception had been exposed. "Eleanor," he began. I held up my hand. "Do not insult me by denying it, Your Grace. I know about Lord Hartington. I know about the bet. I know that you wagered everything you own on a single horse race, and when you realized you could not win without Midnight Storm, you agreed to take me as part of the bargain. Not because my father demanded it, because I was expendable, because a scarred, ugly bride was a small price to pay for the chance to save your fortune." He set down his glass with a careful precision that spoke of barely contained emotion. "That is not," he said slowly, "the whole truth. Then enlighten me." I leaned forward, my voice steady despite the trembling of my hands beneath the table. "Tell me which part of my father's letter was false. Tell me that you did not make that wager. Tell me that you did not marry me solely for my horse." He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence I felt the last fragile threads of hope snap and fall away. He could not deny it. He could not look me in the eye and tell me that I had mattered to him, that I had ever been anything more than a transaction. "The wager is real," he said finally. His voice was low, rough, stripped of all pretense. "I made it 6 months ago, when I was drunk and desperate and convinced that my luck was about to change. Hardington had been taunting me for years, flaunting his victories, reminding me at every turn that I was my father's son, destined to gamble away everything my family had built. I wanted to prove him wrong. I wanted to show the world that I was more than a reckless fool throwing money at horses. And so you bet everything," I said flatly. "Your estate, your fortune, your future." "Yes." He met my gaze, and I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like shame. "I bet everything. And when I realized that I could not possibly win without a horse like Midnight Storm, I went to your father. I offered him anything he wanted, money, land, a title for his grandchildren. He refused it all. He said the only thing he wanted was to see you settled before he died, to know that you would be cared for after he was gone." My heart clenched. My father, my foolish, loving, desperate father, who had spent 7 years watching me wither in the countryside, who had watched society mock and dismiss me, who had never stopped hoping that somewhere, somehow, there was a man who would see past my scar to the woman beneath. He had not forced this marriage on Alexander. He had simply asked for the one thing he wanted most in the world, for me to be wanted. "And you agreed," I whispered, "not because you wanted me, but because you needed the horse." Alexander rose from his chair. He walked the length of the table, his footsteps echoing in the vast silence of the dining room until he stood before me. I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, and I hated myself for noticing how the candlelight softened his features, how the shadows carved his face into something almost tender. "I agreed," he said quietly, "because I was a desperate man with no other options. I agreed because I thought you would be easy to manage, a quiet, grateful wife who would stay out of my way while I saved my fortune. I agreed because I did not know you, Eleanor. I did not know that you would lock your door on our wedding night and demand that I earn the right to stand in your presence. I did not know that you would walk into my stables and tame the most dangerous horse in England with nothing but your voice and your touch. I did not know that you would make me question everything I thought I understood about duty and desire and what it means to truly see another person." I stared at him, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to believe him. God help me. I wanted to believe that something had changed, that the connection I had felt growing between us was real and not another carefully constructed lie. But I had been fooled once. I would not be fooled again. "Pretty words," I said, and my voice came out harder than I intended. "You are very skilled at them, Your Grace. But words do not change the truth. You married me for a horse. You have spent the past 3 weeks pretending to care about me so that I would not cause trouble before your precious race. And now that I know the truth, I must decide what to do about it." "What are you saying?" I rose from my chair, forcing him to step back, forcing a distance between us that felt as necessary as breathing. "I am saying that I will not be managed, Your Grace. I am saying that I am tired of being a pawn in other people's games, moved about the board without my consent, sacrificed for the ambitions of men who see me as a means to an end. I am saying that if you want Midnight Storm to run at Epsom, you will have to earn him, just as you will have to earn me." His jaw tightened. "And how exactly am I supposed to do that?" I looked at him, this beautiful, broken man who had married me for all the wrong reasons, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something that might, in time, become the foundation for something real. "I do not know," I admitted, "but I suggest you start by telling me the truth. All of it. No more secrets, no more deceptions, no more carefully constructed performances designed to keep me placid and ignorant. If you want any chance of winning this race, of winning anything, you will have to show me who you really are." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching my face as though looking for something he had lost. And then slowly he nodded. "Very well," he said. "The truth. All of it." He led me to his study, a dark-paneled room I had never been permitted to enter. The walls were lined with books, the desk cluttered with papers, and above the fireplace hung a portrait of a woman I did not recognize. She was beautiful, with dark hair and pale eyes, and a smile that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. "My mother," Alexander said, following my gaze. "She died when I was 12. Consumption, the doctors said, but I have always believed it was shame that killed her. My father's gambling had already begun to destroy us, and she could not bear to watch the man she loved become a monster." I looked at the portrait, at the sadness hidden in those painted eyes, and I felt something soften in my chest. I had lost my mother too, though to illness rather than despair. I understood what it meant to carry that absence like a weight, to feel the shape of a person who was no longer there. Alexander poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed one to me. I did not usually drink spirits, but I took it anyway, grateful for something to do with my hands. "My father gambled away 3/4 of our fortune before he died," he continued, settling into the chair across from me. "He lost estates, horses, priceless art, anything that could be wagered. By the time I inherited the title, there was almost nothing left. I spent the first 5 years of my dukedom trying to rebuild what he had destroyed, and I swore I would never become like him." "But you did," I said quietly. "You made the same mistakes." He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Yes? I told myself it was different, that I was smarter, luckier, more disciplined. I told myself that one more race, one more wager, would be enough to restore everything we had lost. But the debts kept mounting, and the losses kept piling up, and before I knew it, I was standing in the same pit my father had dug, with no way to climb out. So you made the wager with Hartington." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Charles Hartington is the man who destroyed my father. Not through gambling, though he won his share of wagers against us. Through cruelty. He mocked my father at every opportunity, spread rumors about our financial ruin, turned society against us with whispers and insinuations. My father died believing he had failed, not just his family, but his name. And Hartington was there at the funeral, offering his condolences with a smile that made me want to throttle him. I watched his hands tighten around his glass, watched the firelight dance across his clenched jaw. I had not known this. I had not known that the wager was more than financial desperation, that it was also a battle for something deeper, something that could not be measured in pounds and pence. "So this race," I said slowly, "it is not just about money, it is about vengeance. It is about proving that he did not win," Alexander said fiercely. "It is about showing the world that the Blackwood name still means something, that we are not the broken, ruined family he wanted us to become. It is about standing on that track at Epsom and watching his face when Midnight Storm crosses the finish line first." I understood then, in a way I had not before. I understood the desperation that had driven him to make such a reckless wager, the pain that lurked beneath his cold exterior, the need to redeem a family name that had been dragged through the mud by a father who could not control his demons. It did not excuse what he had done. It did not make the hurt of his deception any less real. But it made him human in a way that the cold, calculating Duke of Ravensmore had never been. "And what happens if you lose?" I asked. "What happens if Midnight Storm does not win?" He was silent for a long moment. "Then everything is gone," he said quietly. "The estate, the stables, the last remnants of my family's legacy. Everything goes to Hartington, and I will be left with nothing but a title and a wife who despises me." I flinched at the word. Despises. Is that what he thought? Is that what I wanted him to think? "I do not despise you," I said, and the admission cost me more than I had expected. "I am angry. I am hurt. I feel betrayed by a man I was beginning to trust. But I do not despise you, Alexander. I do not think I am capable of despising anyone who has shown me the kindness you have shown me these past weeks, even if that kindness was born of ulterior motives." He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. It was not the cool assessment of a man examining his property. It was something warmer, something almost like hope. "It was not born of ulterior motives," he said quietly. "Not all of it. Perhaps at first, yes. Perhaps I told myself that I was simply managing my wife, keeping her content until the race was won. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing the scar and started seeing you. And what I saw, Eleanor, what I see, is the most remarkable woman I have ever known." I did not know what to say. I did not know if I could trust these words, or if they were simply another performance, another carefully constructed lie designed to keep me compliant. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw no deception there. I saw only a man who was as lost as I was, reaching out in the darkness for something to hold on to. "I need time," I said finally. "I need time to understand what this means, to decide whether I can forgive you, to figure out who I want to be in this marriage. I cannot give you promises tonight, Alexander. But I can give you this. I will not sabotage your race. I will not take midnight storm and flee to my father's house. I will stay, and I will watch, and I will see what kind of man you truly are when everything you have is on the line." He nodded slowly, and I saw the tension drain from his shoulders. "That is more than I deserve," he said, "and more than I dared to hope for." We sat together in silence after that, watching the fire burn low. Two strangers who had been bound together by desperation and were only now beginning to understand what that binding might mean. I did not know if I loved him. I did not know if I ever could. But I knew, as I watched the last embers fade to ash, that something had changed between us, something that could never be unchanged. I retired to my chambers alone, and for the first time since my wedding night, I lay awake, not with anger, but with confusion. The man I had married was not the monster I had believed him to be. He was flawed, yes, desperate, reckless, capable of cruelty, born of desperation. But he was also wounded, grieving, trapped by the legacy of a father who had destroyed everything he touched. In that, at least, we were not so different. I fell asleep with his words echoing in my mind. "What I see is the most remarkable woman I have ever known." And when I dreamed not of locked doors and burning letters, but of a man with winter eyes standing in a stable full of light, his hand outstretched, waiting for me to take it. The weeks before Epsom passed in a strange suspension, as though the entire world was holding its breath. I watched Alexander transform before my eyes. The cold, distant Duke who had greeted me on my wedding day began to fade, replaced by a man I barely recognized. He rose before dawn each morning to work with midnight storm in the stables, not as a master commanding a servant, but as a student learning from a teacher. I showed him how to speak to the horse in low, soothing tones, how to move slowly and deliberately, how to earn trust rather than demand obedience. And he listened. For the first time in his life, I think, Alexander Blackwood listened to someone other than himself. We did not speak of love. We did not speak of the future that awaited us beyond the race, whether it would bring triumph or ruin. But we spoke of everything else, in those quiet hours before the household stirred, in the golden light of the stables where midnight storm watched us with knowing eyes. Alexander told me about his childhood, about the mother he had lost and the father who had broken him. I told him about my accident, about the years of isolation and scorn, about the girl who had learned to make herself invisible because invisibility was safer than hope. It was, I realized, a kind of courtship. Not the courtship I had dreamed of as a girl, with ballrooms and flowers and whispered declarations of eternal devotion, but something deeper, something truer. We were learning each other, piece by piece, building a foundation that might one day support the weight of a real marriage. Lily continued to appear in unexpected places, her bright eyes taking in everything, her small presence a constant reminder that life persisted even in the midst of uncertainty. She had taken a particular liking to Midnight Storm, and I often found her perched on the fence of his paddock, watching him run with an expression of pure wonder on her face. "He is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," she told me one afternoon, her voice hushed with reverence. "When he runs, it is like he has wings." I smiled, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "He is special," I agreed, "but you must be careful around him. He is not a pet." "I know," she said solemnly. "He is a warrior, like you." I blinked, startled by her words. "Like me?" She nodded, her gaze far older than her 8 years. "You have scars, but you are not broken. You fight, even when people want you to give up. That is what warriors do." I did not know what to say. I had never thought of myself as a warrior, had never imagined that anyone could look at me and see strength instead of damage. But Lily saw it. This strange, fierce child saw something in me that I had not been able to see in myself. When I told Alexander about the conversation later that evening, he did not laugh or dismiss it. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I could not read and said simply, "She is right." The night before the race, I could not sleep. I wandered the halls of Ravensmoor in my dressing gown, my feet bare against the cold stone floors, my mind spinning with possibilities I could not control. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow Alexander would either reclaim his family's honor or lose everything he had left. And I would be there, watching, waiting, unable to do anything but hope. I found myself in the stables without quite knowing how I got there. Midnight Storm was awake, as though he too sensed the significance of what was to come. He nickered softly when he saw me, pressing his nose against the bars of his stall, and I slipped inside to stand beside him. "You must win," I whispered, running my hands along his neck. Not for Alexander's fortune, not for the wager or the pride or any of the foolish things men care about. You must win because I need to know that good things can still happen. I need to know that the universe has not forgotten how to be kind. The horse snorted, as if to say that he would do his best but could make no promises. I laughed, despite myself, a small, broken sound in the darkness of the stable. "I know," I said. "I know it is not fair to put such weight on you. But you are all I have left to believe in." "That is not true." I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Alexander stood in the doorway of the stall, his hair disheveled, his shirt untucked, as though he had come straight from his bed. He looked younger in the dim light, softer, stripped of the armor he wore during the day. "You are not all she has," he continued, stepping into the stall. His eyes never left mine. "She has me. Whatever happens tomorrow, Eleanor, you have me. I may not be worthy of your trust yet. I may not have earned the right to stand beside you as anything more than the man who bought you for a horse. But I am here, and I am not going anywhere." I stared at him, my throat tight with emotions I could not name. The past weeks had taught me many things about Alexander Blackwood, about the pain he carried and the pride he wore like armor and the desperate hunger beneath his cold exterior. But this was something new. This was vulnerability, raw and unguarded, offered to me like a gift. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why now, the night before the race?" "Because I may not have another chance," he said simply. "Because tomorrow I will be consumed by the race, by the wager, by the need to prove myself to a world that has already written me off as my father's son. And I did not want to face that without telling you the truth." "What truth?" He took another step closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, could smell the sandalwood and leather scent that clung to his skin. His eyes were fixed on mine, and in their depths I saw something that made my breath catch. That I love you, he said. Not because you came with a prize stallion. Not because you are beautiful, though you are. More beautiful than you will ever believe. I love you because you are fierce and proud and utterly unwilling to be broken by a world that has tried its best to destroy you. I love you because you locked your door on our wedding night and demanded that I become someone worthy of you. I love you because every moment I spend in your presence makes me want to be a better man than I have ever been. The words hung between us, fragile and impossible, and I did not know what to say. I had dreamed of love once, before the accident took that dream from me. I had imagined a gentleman in a ballroom, a dance, a courtship conducted according to all the proper rules of society. I had never imagined this, a confession in a horse stall in the middle of the night, from a man who had married me for all the wrong reasons and somehow become everything I never knew I needed. Alexander, I began, but he shook his head. You do not have to say anything, he said. I did not tell you this to demand a response. I told you because you deserve to know, because I could not face tomorrow with this secret sitting heavy in my chest. Whatever you feel, whatever you decide, it will not change what I just said. I love you, Eleanor. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that love, whether you ever return it or not. He turned to go, and I felt something crack open inside me, something that had been locked away for 7 years behind walls of fear and self-protection. I reached out and caught his hand, my fingers closing around his, and he froze. Do not go, I said. My voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the stable, it seemed to echo like a shout. Stay with me. Please. He turned back, his eyes searching my face. And I saw hope there, fragile and desperate, and so painfully familiar. I had worn that same expression once, long ago, before I learned that hope was a luxury I could not afford. But perhaps I had been wrong. Perhaps hope was not a luxury but a necessity, the thing that kept us alive when everything else had been stripped away. I stepped closer to him, close enough to feel his breath on my skin, close enough to see the rapid pulse beating in his throat. I reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheekbone, the place where his brow furrowed with confusion and longing. I do not know if I love you yet, I said honestly. I do not know if I am capable of love after everything that has been taken from me. But I know that when I am with you, I feel like myself again. Not the ugly heiress, not the scarred recluse, not the woman who learned to disappear rather than be seen and found wanting. Just Eleanor. Just me. That is enough, he said hoarsely. That is more than enough. And then he kissed me. It was not like the kisses in the novels I had read as a girl, all swooning romance and breathless passion. It was gentler than that, more tentative, the kiss of two people who had been wounded by the world and were only now learning to trust again. His lips were warm against mine, his hands steady on my waist, and I felt something uncoil in my chest, some knot of fear and loneliness that had been there so long I had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. When we finally pulled apart, we were both trembling. I should go, Alexander said reluctantly. If anyone finds us here together, it will cause a scandal. I laughed, a real laugh, the first one I had managed in longer than I could remember. We are married, Your Grace. I believe scandal is no longer a concern. He smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look young and hopeful and almost unbearably handsome. Even so, he said, I want to do this properly. I want to court you, Eleanor, the way you deserve to be courted. Flowers and poetry and all the ridiculous rituals that young men are supposed to perform when they are trying to win a lady's heart. I raised an eyebrow. You realize I am already your wife. Yes, he said, but you were never my choice. You were a bargain, a transaction, a price I paid for something I wanted more. I want to change that. I want to choose you, Eleanor, every day for the rest of our lives. And I want you to choose me, too. I looked at him, this complicated, infuriating, utterly unexpected man, and I felt the last of my resistance crumble. "Win your race tomorrow," I said. "Show me the man you can be when everything is on the line, and then, perhaps, we can discuss this courtship of yours." He kissed me once more, a quick, fierce press of lips that left me breathless, and then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the night. I stayed in the stall with Midnight Storm for a long time after he left, my hand pressed to my lips, my heart beating a rhythm that felt like the beginning of something new. The day of the Epsom Derby dawned cold and clear. I dressed with care, choosing a gown of deep blue velvet that brought out the amber in my eyes and a matching bonnet that framed my face without hiding it. I did not try to conceal my scar. I was done hiding. Whatever happened today, I would face it as myself, whole and unashamed. The journey to the racecourse took nearly 2 hours. The carriage rattling over rutted roads while I sat across from Alexander and tried not to let my nervousness show. He was pale beneath his tan, his jaw tight with tension, but when he caught me looking at him, he managed a small smile that made my heart clench. The course itself was a sea of humanity, thousands of people crowded together on the hillsides, their voices rising in a cacophony of excitement and anticipation. I had never seen so many people in one place, had never felt so exposed and yet so invisible at the same time. Here, no one cared about my scar. They cared only about the horses, about the race, about the fortunes that would be won and lost in the next few minutes. Alexander led me to the owner's enclosure, a roped-off area near the finish line where the wealthy and titled could watch the race in relative comfort. I saw Lord Hartington there, a portly man with a florid face and small, cruel eyes that reminded me of a pig. He was surrounded by admirers, laughing at something one of them had said, and when he saw Alexander, his smile widened into something ugly. "Blackwood," he called out, his voice carrying across the enclosure. "Come to watch me claim the last of your inheritance?" Alexander's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady when he replied, "Come to watch you lose, Hartington. I hope you have made peace with your creditors." Hartington laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "We shall see," he said. "We shall see." I slipped my hand into Alexander's and squeezed. He looked down at me, surprise flickering across his face, and I saw something in his eyes that looked like gratitude. "You are not alone," I reminded him quietly. "Whatever happens, you are not alone." The race began with the crack of a starting pistol. I held my breath as the horses surged forward, a thundering wave of muscle and determination that made the ground tremble beneath my feet. The crowd erupted around us, thousands of voices raised in a deafening roar, but I heard none of it. My eyes were fixed on one horse and one horse only. Midnight Storm burst from the gate like a creature possessed, his black coat gleaming in the sunlight, his legs eating up the ground with a speed that took my breath away. The other horses fell behind almost immediately, unable to match his power, his grace, his sheer determination. I watched him run, this horse I had raised from a foal, this magnificent creature who had become the center of everything, and I felt tears streaming down my face. He was winning. Against all odds, against all expectation, he was winning. The crowd roared as he crossed the finish line, 3 lengths ahead of his nearest competitor. And I heard Alexander make a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He turned to me, his face alight with joy, and swept me into his arms, lifting me off my feet, spinning me around in front of God and everyone. "We won," he breathed against my ear. "Eleanor, we won." I clung to him, laughing and crying at the same time, and I did not care who was watching. Did not care about propriety or scandal or any of the rules that had governed my life for so long. In that moment, there was only Alexander and me and the impossible, miraculous truth of what had just happened. We had won. When Alexander finally set me down, I saw Hartington standing at the edge of the enclosure, his face purple with rage. He stared at us with an expression of pure hatred, and I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the day. "This is not over," Hartington spat. "Do you hear me, Blackwood? This is not over." Alexander met his gaze steadily. "Yes, it is," he said. "You lost, Hartington. Accept it with whatever grace you can muster and move on." For a moment, I thought Hartington would strike him. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his whole body trembling with suppressed fury. But then something shifted in his expression, something calculating and cold, and he turned away without another word. I watched him go, his broad back disappearing into the crowd, and I could not shake the feeling that we had won the battle, but not the war. There was something in his eyes, something in the careful way he had controlled his rage, that spoke of plans and vengeance yet to come. But that was a worry for another day. Today, we had won. Today, Alexander had reclaimed his family's honor and secured their future. Today, for the first time since my accident, I had stood in public without shame, without fear, and I had been seen not as London's ugliest, but as the Duchess of Ravensmore, the woman who had helped tame the most magnificent horse in England. Alexander took my hand as we walked back to our carriage, and I let him. The weight of his fingers intertwined with mine felt like an anchor, like something solid and real in a world that had always felt so uncertain. Whatever came next, we would face it together. And that, I was beginning to understand, made all the difference. The weeks following Epsom were the happiest I had ever known. Alexander was transformed. The weight that had pressed upon him for so long, the shadow of his father's failures and his own desperate gambles, seemed to lift from his shoulders overnight. He laughed more. He smiled more. He courted me with a devotion that would have seemed absurd had it not been so utterly sincere, bringing me flowers from the greenhouse each morning, reading poetry to me by the fire each evening, stealing kisses in shadowed corridors when he thought no one was looking. I found myself falling in love with him. Not the sudden, thunderbolt love of novels and fairy tales, but something slower, deeper, more profound. I fell in love with the way he listened when I spoke, as though my words were the most important thing in the world. I fell in love with the patience he showed Midnight Storm, the gentleness that lurked beneath his aristocratic reserve. I fell in love with the man he was becoming, the man he had always been capable of being, if only someone had believed in him enough to show him the way. We consummated our marriage on a night in late spring, when the gardens of Ravensmore were heavy with the scent of roses and the moon hung full and silver in a cloudless sky. I will not speak of the details, for some things are too sacred to share. But I will say this. When Alexander touched me, when his hands traced the landscape of my body with reverence and wonder, I felt beautiful for the first time in 7 years. Not despite my scar, but because of everything I was, everything I had survived, everything I had become. Afterward, lying in his arms with my head on his chest and his heartbeat steady beneath my ear, I wept. Not from sorrow, but from the sheer overwhelming relief of being seen, being wanted, being loved. "You are crying," Alexander murmured, his fingers threading through my hair. "Did I hurt you?" "No," I whispered. "You healed me." Society, predictably, was less easily won. The news of our marriage had spread through London like wildfire, carried on the tongues of gossips who delighted in every salacious detail. The Duke of Ravensmore had married the ugliest woman in London for a horse. He had won the Epsom Derby and defeated his rival, but at what cost? What kind of man would bind himself to such a creature? And what kind of woman would accept such a humiliating bargain? I heard the whispers when we attended our first ball together, a grand affair at the Hartington estate of all places. Charles Hartington had issued the invitation himself, a gesture of supposed reconciliation that neither Alexander nor I believed for a moment. But to refuse would have been to show weakness, and we had learned that weakness was something the ton exploited without mercy. I dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a gown of midnight blue silk that hugged my figure and left my shoulders bare. My hair was swept up in an elegant arrangement that left my face fully visible, scar and all. I wore no jewelry except for my wedding ring and a simple strand of pearls that had belonged to my mother. When I descended the staircase of our townhouse in London, Alexander was waiting at the bottom. He looked up at me, and for a moment he simply stared, his lips parted, his eyes dark with an emotion I could not name. "You are magnificent," he said finally. His voice was rough, almost reverent. "Eleanor, you are the most magnificent woman I have ever seen." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the grate. "Then let us show them," I said. "Let us show them all." The Hartington ball was everything I had expected and feared. The ballroom was a glittering sea of silk and diamonds, filled with the cream of London society, and every eye turned toward us as we were announced at the top of the stairs. I felt the weight of their gazes like physical pressure, felt the whispers ripple through the crowd like wind through wheat. The chandeliers above cast their merciless light upon us, upon me, and I knew that every flaw, every imperfection, every inch of my scarred face was visible to the hundreds of people gathered below. "There she is," someone murmured. "The ugly Duchess." Another voice, not bothering to whisper, "I heard he only married her for the horse. Can you imagine?" I lifted my chin and placed my hand on Alexander's arm. He covered my fingers with his own, a small gesture of solidarity that steadied my trembling heart. We descended the stairs together, and I did not flinch, did not falter, did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me cower. I had spent too many years cowering. Tonight, I would show them what it meant to be the Duchess of Ravensmore. Hartington greeted us at the bottom, his smile wide and false, his eyes glittering with something that looked like anticipation. "Ravensmore," he said smoothly, "and the lovely Duchess. How good of you to come." Lovely, I thought. He said it as though it were a jest, a private joke at my expense. But I simply smiled and inclined my head, refusing to let him see how his words cut. The evening progressed much as I expected. We danced, we made polite conversation, we pretended that we did not notice the stares and whispers that followed us everywhere we went. Alexander was a perfect partner, attentive and protective, shielding me from the worst of society's cruelty with his mere presence. But I could see the tension in his jaw, could feel the anger simmering beneath his careful control. It was nearly midnight when everything changed. I had excused myself to find the retiring room, needing a moment of solitude to gather my composure. The corridors of Hartington House were a maze of identical passages, and I soon found myself lost, wandering through unfamiliar halls lined with portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch me with disapproving eyes. That was when I heard the voices. They were coming from a room at the end of the corridor, the door slightly ajar, and I recognized Hartington's oily tones immediately. I should have walked away. I should have returned to the ballroom and pretended I had heard nothing. But something made me pause, made me press myself against the wall and listen. "The forgery is perfect," Hartington was saying. "No one will be able to tell the difference. By the time Blackwood realizes what has happened, it will be too late. And you are certain this will ruin him?" Another voice, one I did not recognize. "Completely?" Hartington laughed, a cold, cruel sound that made my blood run cold. The documents proved that his father's debts were never legally settled, that the estate should have passed to creditors years ago. When I present them to the magistrate, Ravensmore will lose everything. The house, the lands, the horses, everything. And his precious ugly wife will be out on the street where she belongs. I stopped breathing. They were going to destroy us. Hartington had not accepted his defeat at Epsom. He had simply found another way to attack, a more insidious weapon that would strip us of everything we had worked so hard to protect. I did not think. I simply acted. I pushed open the door and stepped into the room, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Hartington and his companion, a thin, weasel-faced man I did not recognize, looked up in shock. "Your Grace," Hartington sputtered, his face going pale. "This is a private conversation." "I imagine it is," I said, and my voice was steady despite the terror coursing through my veins. "Private and criminal. Forgery, I believe, is a hanging offense." The weasel-faced man made a sound of alarm and edged toward the door, but I blocked his path. I was not tall, not physically imposing, but I had survived 7 years of being London's ugliest. 7 years of whispers and scorn and cruelty that would have broken a lesser woman. I was not afraid of these men. I was furious. "You will destroy those documents," I said to Hartington. "Whatever forgeries you have created, whatever schemes you have concocted, you will burn them tonight, and you will never trouble my husband or my family again." Hartington laughed, though there was no humor in it. "And why would I do that? You have no proof of anything. It is your word against mine, and who do you think society will believe? A disgraced nobleman, or the ugly freak he married for a horse?" The words should have hurt. Once, they would have devastated me. But I had spent months learning to see myself through Alexander's eyes, through Lily's eyes, through the eyes of everyone who had looked past my scar and seen the woman beneath. Hartington's cruelty could not touch me anymore. "They will believe the woman who has witnesses," I said calmly. And then, from the doorway behind me, came a voice that made my heart soar. "She is not alone, Hartington." Alexander stepped into the room, and behind him stood a crowd of the Tun's most influential members, drawn by the commotion, their faces a mixture of shock and fascination. They heard everything you said, every word. Hartington's face went from pale to gray. He looked from Alexander to the crowd to me, and I saw the moment he realized that his scheme had collapsed, that his own cruelty had been his undoing. "This is not over," he hissed. "Yes," Alexander said, moving to stand beside me, his hand finding mine in the dim light. "It is." The scandal that followed destroyed Charles Hartington. The witnesses to his confession were too numerous and too prominent to be silenced. Within a week, the story had spread through every drawing room in London. Within a month, Hartington was ruined, his reputation shattered, his fortune seized by creditors who had been waiting years for an opportunity to strike. He fled to the continent, I heard later, to live out his days in the obscurity he had tried to impose on us. But the scandal did something else as well, something I had not expected. It made me famous. The story of the ugly duchess who had saved her husband's fortune, who had faced down a villain in his own house, who had refused to be broken by a society that had spent years trying to destroy her, captured the imagination of London. I became something I had never dreamed of being, a heroine. Women I had never met stopped me in the street to tell me how much they admired my courage. Invitations poured in from hostesses who had once crossed the street to avoid being seen with me. Even the newspapers, those vicious chroniclers of every scandal and shame, began to write about me with something approaching respect. But the greatest change came from within myself. I no longer saw my scar as a mark of shame. I saw it as a badge of survival, a testament to everything I had endured and overcome. When I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw London's ugliest. I saw Eleanor Blackwood, Duchess of Ravensmore, a woman who had been knocked down by fate and had risen stronger. A woman who had found love in the most unlikely of places. A woman who had learned finally to see herself as others saw her, as Alexander saw her. 1 year after our wedding, on a morning bright with autumn sunshine, I gave birth to our first child. She was a girl, small and perfect, with her father's dark hair and my amber eyes. We named her Rose, for the flower Alexander had left outside my door on that first terrible night, and when I held her in my arms for the first time, I wept with a joy so profound it felt like my heart might burst. "She is beautiful," Alexander whispered, standing beside the bed with tears streaming down his face, just like her mother. I looked up at him. This man who had married me for a horse and taught me to believe in love again. I thought of all the years I had spent hiding, all the pain I had endured, all the moments when I had believed that happiness was something that happened to other people, prettier people, people whose faces did not bear the marks of tragedy. And I thought of Lily, that wise and fearless child who had looked at me and seen a warrior. "I am not beautiful," I said softly, looking down at my daughter's sleeping face. "I am scarred and stubborn and far too proud for my own good. But I am loved, and that, I think, is worth more than beauty could ever be." Alexander leaned down and kissed me, a gentle press of lips that spoke of everything we had been through, everything we had become. "You are wrong," he said against my mouth. "You are the most beautiful woman in the world, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Outside the window, the leaves were turning gold and crimson, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of Midnight Storm running in the paddock, his hooves drumming a rhythm that sounded like victory. Lily would be in the kitchen with her mother, perhaps reading a book she was not supposed to have, perhaps dreaming of the day when she too would discover that scars and struggles did not define a person. I held my daughter close and smiled. They had called me London's ugliest. They had whispered behind their fans and crossed the street to avoid me. They had tried to break me with their cruelty and their judgment and their narrow, small-minded ideas about what a woman should be. But I had survived. I had found love in the arms of a man who saw me truly. I had become a mother, a duchess, a warrior in silk and pearls. I had learned that the opinions of society mattered far less than the opinion I held of myself. And when my daughter grew old enough to ask about the scar on my face, I would tell her the truth. I would tell her that once upon a time, a girl was in an accident that changed her life forever. I would tell her about the years of pain and isolation, about the cruel nickname that had followed me through every ballroom and drawing room in London. And then I would tell her about the man who had married me for a horse and stayed because he loved me, about the night I locked my door and demanded to be seen, about the race that changed everything and the villain who tried to destroy us, and the strength I found when I stopped hiding from the world. I would tell her that beauty is not a matter of unblemished skin or perfect features. Beauty is courage. Beauty is resilience. Beauty is standing up when the world wants you to kneel. And my daughter would look at me with her father's eyes, and she would understand. Because she would know, as I now knew, that the truest beauty of all is the beauty of a heart that refuses to break. That was my story. That is how I became not London's ugliest, but something far more precious. I became myself. And if you are reading this, whoever you are, wherever you are, I want you to know something. The world will try to define you by your scars, your failures, your imperfections. It will give you cruel names and crueler expectations. It will tell you that you are not enough, that you will never be enough, that you should hide yourself away and accept the small, diminished life that others have chosen for you. Do not believe them. Lock your door. Demand to be seen. Refuse to be broken by those who cannot see past the surface to the fire that burns within. Because you are more than they know. You are more than you know. And somewhere out there is someone who will see you truly, who will love you not despite your scars, but because of everything you are. Someone who will look at you on your darkest day and say the words that change everything. What I see is fire. Wait for them. Fight for them. And when you find them, do not let go. That is the only happily ever after worth having.